An Amish man married an obese Amish girl for a pig. On wedding night he was shocked. The church bell tolls, the wagon wheels creak, and the whispers cut deeper than any knife. A man weds not for love, but for a pig. The bride, mocked by all, lowers her eyes as neighbors laugh in the dusty street. But when the cabin door closes, the night reveals a truth no one in town could have imagined. She carries a secret, a hidden strength, a deed that could change everything, and a gift that might heal what the world has broken. Now the stakes rise higher. A ruthless elder wants their land. The bishop calls her inheritance a sin, and even the railroad thunders on their doorstep. What begins as shame may become salvation. Yet danger prowls, threats in the night, a pig slaughtered as warning, and a husband torn between fists and faith. Will this unlikely marriage be crushed by greed and scorn? Or will the girl the world despised become the heart that saves them all? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and fresh baked bread as folks gathered at the meeting house. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of the congregation, all eyes fixed on the unlikely pair standing before the bishop. Samantha Yoder's plain black dress hung loose on her large frame, while Sandro Stoltzfus stood rigid in his best dark suit, his weather-worn hands clasped tightly before him. The usual wedding songs had been sung, their voices rising in familiar German hymns that seemed to hang heavy in the air today. When it came time for the giving of gifts, Samantha's father led forward a spotted pig, its rope leash stretched tight as it pulled against his grip. "For the new household," he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. Whispers erupted like dry leaves in a windstorm. "A pig?" Emma Bontrager muttered to her sister. "What kind of dowry is that for a daughter?" Sarah Miller pressed her lips together, barely containing her smirk. Well, what else could they expect? Look at the size of her. The cruel words reached Samantha's ears, and her cheeks burned hot with shame. Her prayer book trembled in her hands as she stared straight ahead, trying to find strength in the familiar words printed on its pages. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of daily reading, just like her grandmother's had been. Sandro stepped forward, his face unreadable as stone. He accepted the pig's rope with a slight bow of his head, though his jaw tightened beneath his beard. The animal squealed and tugged, drawing a few poorly hidden chuckles from the men standing near the back. The bishop cleared his throat, pressing on with the ceremony. His words about love and duty seemed to float past Samantha as she struggled to keep her composure. She spoke her vows in a voice barely above a whisper, while Sandro's responses came out gruff and short. When it was done, they climbed into Sandro's wagon. The wooden seat creaked as Samantha settled her weight onto it. The pig was secured in the back, its protests echoing behind them as Sandro clucked to his horse. They rode in silence through the settlement, past neat farms and ordered fields ready for harvest. Curious faces appeared in windows and doorways as they passed. Mary Zook stood openly on her porch, arms crossed as she watched them go by. "That poor Stoltzfus man," Samantha heard her say. "First his Sarah dies, and now this." The sun was setting by the time they reached Sandro's farm. The modest white house stood quiet against the darkening sky, its windows dark and uninviting. The barn needed fresh paint, and the garden looked half-tended, telling the story of a widower struggling to keep up with his work. Sandro helped Samantha down from the wagon, though he was careful not to meet her eyes. He led the pig to an empty pen while she made her way inside to prepare their first meal as husband and wife. Her hands shook as she lit the lamp and looked around the kitchen that had once been Sarah's domain. The supper table was set with simple fare, bread, butter, and a pot of beef stew Samantha had made the day before. They sat across from each other, the lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. The only sounds were the scraping of spoons against bowls and the pig's occasional squeals from outside. Through the open window, voices drifted from neighboring porches where families gathered in the cool evening air. "Did you see that pig?" someone asked, followed by muffled laughter. "Ain't never seen the like at a proper wedding." Samantha stirred her stew, each bite tasting like dust in her mouth. She sneaked a glance at Sandro, wondering what he was thinking. His face was drawn, tired lines etched deep around his mouth as he mechanically spooned food into his mouth. Was he already regretting his choice to marry her? The lamplight flickered across his features, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of uncertainty in his eyes before he looked away. Here they sat, two souls brought together by necessity rather than love. She with her grandfather's deed that could save his farm from debt, and he with his empty house that needed a woman's touch. But now, with the mockery of the pig dowry hanging over them like a storm cloud, even those practical reasons seemed to mock their union. The evening stretched long before them, filled with awkward silence and the weight of unspoken words. Outside, the autumn night grew darker, and one by one the voices of the neighbors faded away. Still, the shame of the day clung to them both like burrs, sharp and persistent. Dawn painted the farmhouse windows in soft gold as Samantha stirred from sleep. The unfamiliar bed creaked beneath her as she rose, careful not to wake Sandro. Her bare feet touched the cool wooden floor, and she pulled her shawl tight against the morning chill. In the kitchen, she moved with practiced ease despite the unfamiliar space. The cast-iron stove waited patiently as she built up the fire, just as she had done countless mornings in her father's house. Soon the kitchen filled with warmth and the comforting smell of coffee brewing. Samantha kneaded dough for fresh breakfast rolls, her strong hands working the mixture with confidence. The familiar task gave her time to think, to prepare herself for whatever the day might bring. Outside, birds welcomed the sunrise with their morning songs. Heavy footsteps on the stairs announced Sandro's approach. He entered the kitchen already dressed for farm work, his expression guarded as if expecting the awkward silence of the previous evening to continue. "Good morning," Samantha said softly, sliding a cup of coffee across the table. "I thought we might talk about how you like things kept here." Surprise flickered across Sandro's face. He wrapped his calloused hands around the warm cup, studying her over its rim. "Ain't much to tell," he said gruffly. "Been managing well enough on my own." "I noticed the quilts need mending," she continued, pulling golden rolls from the oven. "And perhaps we could discuss which vegetables you'd prefer in the garden come spring." Before Sandro could respond, an ear-splitting squeal erupted from the pig pen outside. The sound was so unexpected and so perfectly timed that Samantha couldn't help but laugh. To her amazement, Sandro's lips twitched, and suddenly he was chuckling too, the deep sound warming the kitchen better than any stove. "That pig of yours sure has opinions," he said, shaking his head. "She comes by it honest," Samantha replied, surprising herself with her boldness. This earned her another small smile from Sandro, and something tight in her chest began to loosen. The day passed in a blur of chores and settling in. As evening approached, Sandro grew increasingly tense, his movements becoming stiffer as night drew near. Samantha could read his thoughts as clearly as if they were written on his face. He was dreading their wedding night, expecting it to be as awkward as their first meeting. But when they retired to their bedroom, Samantha didn't shrink away as he'd clearly expected. Instead, she lit the lamp and pulled a small leather pouch from her trunk. "I've been meaning to tell you," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My grandmother was known for her way with healing herbs. She taught me everything she knew before she passed." Sandro sat on the edge of the bed, his expression curious despite himself. "Healing herbs?" "Yes. I noticed your brown cow seems sickly. I might be able to help her if you're willing to let me try." Samantha opened the pouch, releasing the sweet scent of dried herbs into the air. Grandmother always said God put healing in plants for those who know where to look. "You know about cattle?" Sandro asked, genuine interest replacing his earlier discomfort. "I know about many things," Samantha replied simply, neither boasting nor apologizing. She began explaining the properties of different herbs, her quiet confidence filling the room. Sandro found himself leaning forward, drawn in by her knowledge and the gentle way she spoke of it. This wasn't the meek, shame-filled woman he'd expected when he'd agreed to marry her. Here was someone with depth, with skills he hadn't imagined. When they finally lay down to sleep, neither found rest easily. Sandro stared at the ceiling, his mind turning over this new understanding of his wife. The woman beside him wasn't the burden he'd feared she might be. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with size or appearance. Samantha lay awake as well, listening to Sandro's breathing in the darkness. She'd seen the respect in his eyes when she'd spoken of her grandmother's teachings, so different from the pity or mockery she was used to receiving. Perhaps there was more to this arranged marriage than merely escaping gossip and sharing resources. The night wrapped around them like a quilt, and in the darkness, both felt the first stirrings of something unexpected. Hope that perhaps the whispers and assumptions of others hadn't told the whole story of who they might be together. Outside, their dowry pig settled into her new pen with a contented grunt, as if she knew something about this match that others had yet to discover. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Samantha rose early, gathering her grandmother's leather satchel of herbs before heading to the barn. Sandro followed, his footsteps heavy with doubt as they approached the sick cow's stall. The brown cow lay on her side in the straw, her breathing shallow. Her usual bright eyes were dull, and she hadn't touched her feed in days. Samantha knelt beside the animal, running gentle hands along her flank, while Sandro watched from the doorway. "How long has she been like this?" Samantha asked, opening her satchel. "Near on 3 days now," Sandro replied, arms crossed. "Veterinary said there weren't much hope." Samantha nodded, pulling out various dried herbs and setting them on a clean cloth. "The Lord provides healing through his creation, if we know where to look." Her fingers moved surely as she sorted through the plants. "My grandmother taught me that every herb has its purpose." She began mixing the herbs with water from a clay jar, working them into a thick paste. As she worked, her lips moved in quiet prayer, asking for guidance and healing. Sandro shifted uncomfortably at this display of faith, but remained silent. With careful movements, Samantha applied the poultice to the cow's belly, binding it with clean strips of cloth. "Now we wait," she said, settling onto a wooden milking stool. "Would you sit with me?" Sandro hesitated, then pulled up another stool. They sat in companionable silence as morning light filtered through the barn's high windows. After an hour, the cow's breathing deepened. By mid-morning, she lifted her head, nosing at the hay near her muzzle. Sandro leaned forward, disbelief plain on his face. When the cow struggled to her feet and began eating in earnest, he let out a long breath. "I never would have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Sometimes the simplest remedies are the ones we overlook," Samantha said softly, packing away her herbs. "I reckon I was wrong about some things," Sandro admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Seems you have wisdom I never expected." They spent the rest of the day working side by side, falling into an easier rhythm than before. When evening came, Samantha prepared a simple supper of beef stew and fresh bread. As they sat down to eat, her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her apron. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, meeting Sandro's eyes across the table. "Something I've been holding close." Sandro set down his spoon, giving her his full attention. "My grandfather." Samantha paused, gathering her courage. "Before he passed, he left me something. A deed." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope, worn at the edges from being carried close. "He said I wasn't to speak of it until I was wed." Sandro took the envelope with careful hands. The official stamp was clear even in the lamplight, and when he unfolded the paper, his eyes widened at the signature. "This is for the Morrison tract," he said hoarsely. "The fertile land that borders this farm to the east." Samantha nodded. Grandfather knew people might try to take advantage if they knew an unmarried woman held such a deed. "He made me promise to keep it secret until I had a husband to help protect it." Sandro stared at the paper, then at Samantha, seeing her anew. This woman, who had come to him with a pig for a dowry, actually brought one of the richest pieces of farmland in the county. "This could change everything for us," he said slowly. "With soil like that, we could grow twice the crop we do now." "I know it's a surprise," Samantha said, her voice small. "I hope you're not angry I kept it from you." "Angry?" Sandro shook his head, carefully refolding the deed. "No, I reckon you showed good sense, just like with the cow today. You're proving wiser than most folks thought." He handed the deed back to her, including me. That night, as they prepared for bed, Sandro turned to her in the darkness. "Thank you," he said softly, "for trusting me with this." Samantha lay in bed, listening to the familiar night sounds of the farm, the lowing of the recovered cow, the rustle of wind in the corn, and now the gentle breathing of her new husband beside her. She closed her eyes and prayed silently, asking for courage for whatever tomorrow might bring. The deed in her trunk might promise prosperity, but she knew well enough that such promises often came with complications of their own. The next morning brought a crisp autumn breeze that rustled the remaining leaves on the maple trees. Sandro hitched his bay mare to the wagon while Samantha wrapped the precious deed in a clean handkerchief. They needed answers about its legitimacy, and the notary in town was their best hope. "Best we keep this quiet like," Sandro said, helping Samantha onto the wooden seat. The wagon creaked as she settled herself, clutching her bundle close. "No sense stirring up trouble before we know what's what." They rode in companionable silence, the horses' hooves clicking steadily against the packed dirt road. Samantha noticed how Sandro sat straighter today, as if the possibility of prosperity had already lightened his burden. The morning sun warmed their faces as they passed other farms, where curious eyes watched their progress from behind curtained windows. In town, they tied the horse at the hitching post outside the notary's office. The bell above the door tinkled as they entered, and Mr. Peterson looked up from his desk, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Sandro Stoltzfus," the notary said, nodding, "and Mrs. Stoltzfus. What brings you folks in today?" Samantha carefully unfolded the deed, while Sandro explained in low tones about her grandfather's bequest. Neither noticed Aaron Zook, their neighbor, lingering near the post office window next door, his ear turned towards the thin wall between buildings. Mr. Peterson examined the document carefully, holding it up to the light. "This appears entirely legitimate," he confirmed, running his finger along the official seal. "Your grandfather was a shrewd man. Pardon me, Mrs. Stoltzfus. This land would be valuable to anyone, but especially now with the railroad survey crews about." Aaron Zook's footsteps hurried away from the wall, but Sandro and Samantha were too absorbed in the notary's explanation to notice. They spent another hour reviewing the deed's details, making sure everything was in proper order. By the time they left the office, the autumn sun had passed its peak. They stopped at the general store for supplies, where the shopkeeper's wife watched them with unusual interest. Whispers seemed to follow them down the street to their wagon. "Something feels different," Samantha murmured as they started home. "Like eyes are following us." Sandro clicked to the horse, his jaw tight. News travels fast in small towns, especially news about land and money. They were right to be worried. As they approached their farm at sunset, they spotted a familiar black buggy waiting by their gate. Bishop Heinrich Lapp stood beside it, his tall form casting a long shadow in the fading light. "The Lord's peace be with you," the bishop intoned as they pulled up, though his stern expression suggested anything but peace. Sandro helped Samantha down from the wagon. From the pig pen came nervous squealing, as if their porcine wedding gift sensed the tension in the air. "We hear you've been conducting business with the English today," Bishop Lapp said, his grey beard catching the last rays of sunlight. "Concerning matters of worldly gain." "We were simply confirming what was already ours," Sandro replied carefully. "Through Samantha's grandfather's will." The bishop's eyes narrowed. The community has concerns about members holding land that might draw railroad interests. Such dealings often lead to pride and separation from our ways. He turned his sharp gaze to Samantha. "Your grandfather may have meant well, but such an inheritance could endanger your standing in the church." Samantha's hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. "With respect, Bishop Lapp, we've done nothing wrong. The land was given in love, and we mean to use it to support our family and community." "Pride comes before a fall," the bishop warned. "I suggest you both pray carefully about this matter." He climbed into his buggy, gathering the reins. "The church council will want to discuss this further." They watched him drive away, the buggy's wheels leaving deep ruts in the dirt. The pig's anxious squealing had settled to occasional grunts, as if it too felt the bishop's departure ease the tension. Inside their cabin, Samantha lit the lamps, while Sandro prepared a simple supper of bread and soup. Neither spoke much as they ate. When the dishes were done, Sandro began pacing the wooden floor, his stockinged feet making soft, shuffling sounds against the boards. "What are we to do?" he finally asked, more to himself than to Samantha. Samantha didn't answer immediately. Instead, she knelt beside their bed, clasping her hands in prayer. The lamplight cast her shadow on the wall, making it seem as though two of her were praying instead of one. Sandro watched her for a moment, then resumed his pacing. Their marriage, which had just begun to find its footing, now felt entangled in something larger than themselves. The simple life they'd hoped for had become complicated by politics, power, and the watchful eyes of their community. Through the open window came the evening sounds of their farm, crickets chirping, the soft lowing of the recovered cow, and the occasional snuffle from the pig. But underneath it all lay a new tension, as if the very air had changed with the bishop's visit. Their private world had been breached, and there would be no going back to the quiet life they'd just begun to build. A week passed like molasses dripping from a spoon. Each day brought more uninvited visitors to the Stoltzfus farm, their buggies and wagons raising dust along the lane. They came with pies and good wishes, but their eyes wandered to the fertile tract beyond the fence line. Samantha watched from her kitchen window as another group meandered across their yard. Mrs. Miller and her two daughters made a show of admiring the autumn flowers, while their menfolk kicked at clumps of soil and muttered about crop yields. "Fine bottomland you've got here," Mr. Miller called out to Sandro, who was replacing boards on the barn door. "Richest soil I've seen in the county." Sandro only nodded, driving another nail with perhaps more force than necessary. The constant stream of visitors wore on his patience, their false smiles barely masking their covetous glances. By mid-afternoon, the yard had filled with more neighbors. Women clustered near the house, speaking in low voices while stealing glances at Samantha through the windows. Men wandered the property's edge, pointing towards the creek that marked the boundary of the inherited land. The railroad surveyors say this would be perfect for their planned route, one man said loudly enough to carry, straight and level as God's own ruler. The pig, which had grown noticeably in the week since the wedding, rooted contentedly in its pen, oblivious to the tension around it. Samantha had taken to talking to the creature while doing her chores, finding its uncomplicated presence soothing amid the growing pressure. As the sun began its descent, the visitors finally departed, leaving behind half-eaten pies and trampled grass. Sandro and Samantha settled onto their porch steps, watching the golden light fade from the fields. The pig's gentle snuffling provided a peaceful counterpoint to their troubled thoughts. "My grandfather wasn't a foolish man," Samantha said softly, her hands folded in her lap. "He knew this land would be valuable someday, but he didn't leave it to me out of greed." She turned to look at Sandro, her eyes earnest in the fading light. "He wanted to ensure I'd have a future, something of my own to bring to a marriage." Sandro was quiet for a long moment, watching shadows lengthen across their yard. "When I agreed to marry you," he began slowly, "I thought only of survival. My farm was failing, and I needed help." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But now, seeing how they treat you, how they whisper and scheme," his calloused hands clenched, "I find myself wanting to protect more than just the land." Samantha's eyes welled with tears at his words, but before she could respond, the clip-clop of approaching hooves drew their attention. A single buggy appeared on their lane, its driver's broad-brimmed hat marking him as Elder Jonas Brandt. The pig grew quiet as the buggy stopped before their gate. Elder Brandt stepped down, his prosperity evident in his well-oiled boots and the silver watch chain at his vest. He approached the porch with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Evening, Sandro." "Samantha." He removed his hat, revealing steel-grey hair and sharp eyes. "Fine evening for a chat about business." Sandro stood, positioning himself slightly in front of Samantha. "We've had enough visitors today, Elder Brandt." The elder smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be brief then. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for the deed to that bottom land. $5,000, cash in hand." He reached into his vest pocket, producing a thick envelope. More money than you'd see in 10 years of farming. The pig began to stir restlessly in its pen, as if sensing the tension in the air. Samantha rose to stand beside her husband, her shoulder touching his arm. "The land's not for sale," Sandro said firmly. "At any price." Elder Brandt's smile faded. "Don't be hasty, young man. That land will bring changes, whether you want them or not. The railroad's coming and standing in its way." He shook his head slowly. "Well, that could make life difficult for a young couple, especially ones hoping to stay in good standing with the church." "My grandfather gave me that land as a blessing." Samantha spoke up, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Not as a burden to be sold off to the highest bidder." The elder studied them both for a long moment, tucking the envelope back into his vest. "Blessings can turn to curses mighty quick when pride gets in the way." He settled his hat back on his head, his eyes hard in the gathering dusk. "Think carefully about my offer. There are other ways to acquire land when reason fails to persuade." He turned and walked back to his buggy, each step measured and deliberate. The sound of his departure faded into the evening air, leaving behind a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. The pig's anxious squealing broke the silence. Sandro and Samantha remained on their porch, watching darkness claim their threatened land, each lost in thoughts of what tomorrow might bring. Dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle pinks and golds as Samantha stood in the doorway of their cabin, her arms crossed with determination. The previous evening's threats from Elder Brandt still echoed in her mind, but she refused to let fear rule her days. With quiet resolve, she tied on her apron and set to work. The cabin's interior had gathered dust and cobwebs during Sandro's months of widowerhood. Samantha attacked the grime with soap and water, her strong arms making quick work of the wooden floors. She flung open windows to let in fresh air, and soon the musty smell gave way to sunshine and pine-scented cleaner. Outside, the pig watched her through the fence slats, its curious snuffling bringing a smile to her face. Between scrubbing sessions, she approached the pen with kitchen scraps and a gentle voice. "Come here, girl," she called softly, holding out an apple core. The pig trotted over, its pink snout twitching. "That's right. We're going to prove them all wrong, aren't we?" To her delight, the pig seemed to respond to her voice, following her movements along the fence. Samantha began incorporating simple commands: come, stay, turn, rewarding success with treats and gentle praise. The creature's intelligence surprised her, and soon it was responding to her words with almost dog-like attention. Near midday, Sandro returned from mending the north pasture fence, pausing at the sight of their transformed home. The windows gleamed in the sunlight, and fresh-washed curtains fluttered in the breeze. The porch boards had been swept clean, and along its edge, neat rows of freshly planted herbs spread their delicate leaves. "I hope you don't mind," Samantha said, wiping her hands on her apron. "My grandmother taught me about healing plants. These will be useful come winter." Sandro ran a calloused hand along the new herb bed. "Mint for upset stomachs," he identified, then pointed to another plant. "And this one's for fever?" "Yes." Samantha's face lit up. "You know herbs?" "My mother grew them," he admitted softly, before she passed. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the pig's gentle grunting as it followed Samantha to the water pump. To Sandro's amazement, it sat quietly while she filled its trough, waiting for her gentle, "Go ahead," before drinking. "You've trained it," he said, unable to hide his surprise. Samantha smiled. "She's smart. Like most creatures God made, she just needs patience and kindness." She straightened up, brushing dirt from her skirts. "I've been thinking about this land, Sandro. About why my grandfather might have wanted me to have it." Sandro leaned against the pump, his expression curious. "Tell me." Inside, the cabin's newly cleaned main room glowed with evening light as they sat down to supper. The simple meal of bread and stew seemed somehow more appetizing in the freshened space. Samantha poured tea into cups that now sparkled from their scrubbing. "I've seen so many widows struggle," she began, her voice soft but passionate, "and orphans with nowhere to go. This land, it's big enough to help people. We could build small houses, teach farming skills." Her eyes shone with the vision. "Make it a place of refuge where healing can happen." Sandro stirred his stew thoughtfully. The idea seemed impossible given their current troubles, yet he found himself touched by her courage to dream. The woman before him was so different from the one he'd reluctantly married. Her strength ran deep, like an underground spring. "The elders would fight it," he said gently. "They already oppose us keeping the land at all." "Yes," Samantha agreed, "but sometimes doing right means standing firm." She reached across the table and touched his hand. "Like you did yesterday with Elder Brandt." The simple touch sent warmth through Sandro's chest. As darkness gathered outside, they cleaned up together, moving in comfortable harmony around the kitchen. The pig's occasional snuffles drifted in through the window, now a familiar and almost comforting sound. Later, as they prepared for bed, Sandro watched Samantha braid her hair by lamplight. The simple domestic scene stirred something in him, not just gratitude for her help with the farm, but a deeper appreciation for her spirit. "I never expected this," he said quietly. Samantha paused in her braiding. "Expected what?" "To feel hope again." He moved to stand beside her. "After Rachel died, I thought that part of me was finished. But you—" He gestured to the transformed cabin, the herb garden visible in the moonlight, the contentedly sleeping pig. "You make me believe in possibilities again." Tears gleamed in Samantha's eyes, but her smile was radiant. The lamplight cast a gentle glow as husband and wife stood together, their shadows merging on the freshly swept floor. Outside, a cool autumn breeze carried the scent of their new herb garden through the clean curtains, promising tomorrow would bring another day of quiet courage and growing love. 3 days after Samantha planted her herb garden, a hesitant knock interrupted the morning chores. Sandro opened the cabin door to find widow Martha Kaufman wringing her hands on their porch, a feverish child bundled in her arms. "I heard tell," the widow said softly, "that your wife knows something of healing herbs." Samantha appeared behind Sandro, drying her hands on her apron. "Come in, sister," she said warmly, ushering them towards the kitchen table. The child's cheeks blazed red, his breathing labored. While Sandro hovered uncertainly by the door, Samantha worked with quiet efficiency. She laid a cool cloth on the boy's forehead and prepared a tea from the mint and elderberry she'd harvested that morning. Her large hands moved with surprising gentleness as she helped the child sip the brew. "There now," she murmured, adding a prayer as she worked. "The Lord provides healing through his green earth." She showed the widow how to make a chest poultice from herbs, explaining each step with patience. Sandro watched from his corner, struck by the tenderness in his wife's movements. The same hands that scrubbed floors and trained their pig now soothed a suffering child. When the boy's breathing eased and his fever began to break, Widow Kaufman's eyes filled with grateful tears. Word spread quickly through the settlement. The next morning brought Sarah Byler with her daughter's infected cut. Then Rachel Zook arrived, desperate over her infant's colic. Each time, Samantha welcomed them into the cabin, sharing her grandmother's remedies along with quiet prayers and gentle instruction. Sandro found himself adapting to the steady stream of visitors. He built extra chairs for the kitchen and cleared a space by the herb garden where waiting families could sit. The pig, now remarkably well behaved, entertained anxious children with her tricks while their siblings received treatment inside. "You have a gift," he told Samantha one evening as they watched the sun set from their porch. "The way you help them, it's like watching a miracle." Samantha blushed, smoothing her apron. "God gives the healing. I just tend his garden." The grateful families began bringing small offerings. Mary Stoltzfus left a carefully stitched quilt, its pattern showing healing herbs. The Yodas brought fresh-baked choufle pies, still warm from the oven. Jacob Miller arrived with his sons and a wagon full of split firewood, enough to last through winter. But most precious were the smiles and greetings that replaced the former whispers and turned backs. Women who had once mocked Samantha's size now sought her counsel on their children's health. Men who had questioned Sandro's judgment in marrying her now touched their hats respectfully when passing. One evening, as they sat at supper, Samantha laid down her fork with unusual solemnness. "I've been praying about the land," she said, "about how to use it as God intends." Sandro nodded, encouraging her to continue. "What if we raised a barn?" Her eyes shone with the vision. Not just for storage, but as a shelter. A place where widows could stay when they're struggling, where orphans could find a home. Sandro's fork paused halfway to his mouth. The elders have seen God's work in the healing. Samantha finished gently. Perhaps their hearts have softened. He considered the changes of recent weeks, the growing respect in neighbors' eyes, the gratitude of helped families, the sense of purpose that had transformed their marriage from mere convenience to deep partnership. It won't be easy, he warned. Some will still oppose us, but others will help. Samantha replied. I believe that now. As if proving her words, the next day brought unexpected support. Widow Kaufman arrived with her recovered grandson, announcing that her sons wished to help with any barn raising. The Millers offered timber from their woodlot. Even young Matthew Yoder, whose mother Samantha had helped through a difficult pregnancy, volunteered his carpentry skills. They gathered that Sunday afternoon around the Stoltzfus kitchen table. Neighbors who had become friends, families who had found healing, young men eager to prove their worth. Together they sketched plans on spare paper, a sturdy 2-story structure with room for multiple families, a large kitchen for communal meals, space for Samantha to grow and prepare her medicines. We'll need to store up supplies, Sandro said, warming to the project despite his lingering concerns. Gather tools, prepare the site, and pray, Samantha added softly. Always pray. The pig wandered past the open door, now responding to her name, Hope, which Samantha had given her. Like their marriage, like their land, like their growing dream of shelter for the needy, what had begun in mockery was transforming into something beautiful. As dusk approached, their visitors departed with promises to return, leaving Sandro and Samantha surrounded by planning papers and the lingering warmth of community support. The herb garden cast long shadows across their porch, its healing fragrance mixing with the evening air. Inside their now busy cabin, signs of their neighbors' gratitude, quilts, pies, warmth of wood fire, testified to the power of kindness to change hearts. Samantha's gentle wisdom had done more than heal bodies. It had begun healing the very fabric of their community. And now, with the barn-raising plans taking shape, they dared to hope for even greater restoration. Dawn painted the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Samantha stepped onto the porch. The air held the crisp sweetness of early autumn, and already she could hear the distant rumble of approaching wagons. Her heart fluttered with nervous excitement as she smoothed her apron and offered a silent prayer. Sandro emerged from the barn, his face showing the same mix of anticipation and worry she felt. They're coming, he said softly, standing beside her. Together they watched as the first wagon crested the hill, followed by another and another. The Millers arrived first, their wagon piled high with fresh-cut timber. Behind them came the Kaufmans, tools rattling in their cart. Soon the yard filled with horses, wagons, and the cheerful greetings of neighbors. Women carried covered dishes to the outdoor tables Sandro had built, while men gathered around the marked foundation, discussing the day's work ahead. Hope, the pig that had once been a symbol of mockery, now trotted happily among the arriving children. Samantha had taught her to sit and roll over, much to the little one's delight. Their laughter rang across the morning air as Hope performed her tricks for bits of apple. "Time to begin," called Jacob Miller, clapping his hands. Men shed their jackets and lined up to raise the first beam. Sandro took his place among them, his shoulders straight with pride. Samantha joined the women at the food tables, organizing dishes and preparing for the long day ahead. She watched as the men heaved the massive beam upward, their voices joining in a unified grunt of effort. The timber rose slowly, steadily, until it stood tall against the autumn sky. "Praise be," whispered Martha Kaufman beside her. "Who would have thought we'd see such a day?" Throughout the morning, the barn took shape beam by beam. The sound of hammers echoed across the field, punctuated by calls for nails or tools. Women moved between the workers with water and encouragement, while children darted about on errands. At midday, Samantha rang the dinner bell. Workers gathered around the laden tables, their faces shining with sweat and satisfaction. She had prepared her best dishes: chicken and dumplings, fresh bread, apple pies. But other women had brought equally generous portions. The simple meal became a feast of community. "Your herb saved my Sarah's arm," Rachel Zook said as she helped serve. "This barn will be a blessing to many." Sandro found Samantha during the meal, touching her hand briefly. "Come see," he said, leading her to the partially completed structure. The framework rose strong and true, the beginnings of a shelter that would welcome those in need. Samantha's eyes filled with tears as she imagined the lives that would find refuge here. The afternoon brought renewed energy. More beams rose skyward, walls took shape, and the roof began to spread its protective embrace over all. Even those who had once whispered against them worked alongside their neighbors, caught up in the spirit of the day. Hope continued to entertain the children, now wearing a small flower wreath some little girl had made. The pig's transformation from an object of ridicule to a beloved pet seemed to mirror the change in the community itself. As the sun began its westward slide, the last shingle was nailed in place. Workers stepped back, tools finally lowered, to admire their creation. The barn stood proud and sturdy against the evening sky, its fresh wood glowing in the golden light. "This is more than a barn," the bishop said, his voice carrying across the tired but satisfied crowd. "This is a testament to what we can achieve together." Families gradually departed, leaving behind empty dishes, tired smiles, and promises to return for the next stage of work. Soon only the lengthening shadows remained, stretching across the new barn's solid walls. That evening, Sandro and Samantha sat in their kitchen, a single lamp casting warm light across the table between them. Their bodies ached from the day's labor, but their hearts were full. "I never thought," Sandro began, then paused, searching for words. "When we married, I thought only of survival." Samantha reached across the table, her large, gentle hand covering his. "As did I. But now." He met her eyes, seeing in them the same warmth that had gradually filled his heart. "Now I thank God every day for bringing you to me, not for the land or the healing you bring others, but for you, Samantha." She blushed, but didn't look away. "And I thank him for your strength, your protection, for believing in me when others wouldn't." Outside, Hope snuffled contentedly in her pen. The new barn stood sentinel in the darkness, ready to shelter those in need. But in the quiet kitchen, Sandro and Samantha found themselves marveling at their own transformation, from a marriage of convenience to one of deep, abiding love. They sat together in comfortable silence, their joined hands resting on the well-worn table, while the lamp's gentle light wrapped them in its warm embrace. The day's success had proven what their hearts already knew, that love, like a barn raising, was strongest when built by many hands working as one. The autumn morning dawned grey and heavy with mist. Samantha stood at the kitchen window, watching droplets gather on the new barn's weathered boards. 2 days had passed since the joyful barn raising, but already that celebration felt like a distant memory. The clip-clop of approaching hooves drew her attention. Through the fog, she made out young Timothy Fisher on his father's horse, clutching what appeared to be a letter. Her heart sank. Official mail rarely brought good tidings. "From the railroad office, Ma'am," Timothy said, handing her the envelope before turning his mount toward home. Samantha's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Sandro appeared at her shoulder, his presence steady as she unfolded the crisp paper. The words struck like hammer blows. Notice is hereby given that the Western Railroad Company claims right-of-way across the tract, recorded in deed number 412. Survey markers to be placed within 30 days. Construction to commence in spring. The letter slipped from her fingers. Sandro caught it, his jaw tightening as he read. "They can't just take what's rightfully yours," he said, but uncertainty threaded through his voice. Before they could discuss it further, a second rider approached, this time the bishop's youngest son. "Bishop Lapp requires your presence," he announced formally. "Both of you, this afternoon at 2:00. They hitched the wagon in silence, the weight of worry settling between them like a physical presence. As they drove, Samantha clutched her prayer book, her lips moving in silent supplication. Sandro's knuckles showed white on the reins. The bishop's house loomed ahead, austere and imposing. Several elders' buggies already stood in the yard. Inside, Bishop Lapp sat at the head of his table, hands folded over his Bible, face stern as carved stone. "Samantha Stoltzfus," he began, using her married name but making it sound like an accusation. "You cling to worldly possessions that bring nothing but trouble to our community." "The land was my grandfather's gift," Samantha replied softly, "meant to help those in need." "It draws the railroad's eye," the bishop countered. "Their workers will bring drinking, gambling, loose ways. Already there is talk of a depot, stores, all manner of English influence." "We've done nothing wrong," Sandro spoke up, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Haven't you?" Bishop Lapp's gaze was cold. "That barn you raised, a beacon to outsiders. Your wife's herbs drawing English visitors. Now this railroad business. Where will it end?" "With respect," Samantha said, "my grandfather believed—" "Your grandfather is dead," the bishop cut in. "And you dishonor his memory with this stubborn pride." The meeting dragged on, a litany of accusations wrapped in scripture. When finally released, Samantha felt bruised in spirit, though no hand had touched her. Sandro helped her into the wagon, his movements gentle despite the fury she sensed beneath his calm. The sun hung low as they approached their farm. Something felt wrong before they even reached the gate. The usual greeting snuffles from Hope's pen were missing. "Stay here," Sandro ordered, jumping down. But Samantha was already following, her heart pounding against her ribs. They found Hope in her pen, lying still in a dark pool that shouldn't have been there. Her throat had been cut clean across, her flesh savaged by multiple knife wounds. On the pen's wall, someone had carved a crude warning. "Sell." Samantha's legs gave way. She sank to her knees in the mud, a keening cry rising from deep within her. Hope, sweet, clever Hope, who had transformed from an object of mockery to a beloved pet, lay murdered as a message. Sandro's whole body shook with rage. His hands clenched and unclenched as he stared at the desecrated pen. "I'll kill them," he whispered. "Whoever did this, I swear—" "No." Samantha's voice quavered, but held firm. "Violence brings only more violence." She reached for his hand, drawing him down beside her. "We must pray." "Prayer won't stop these devils," he protested. "Prayer stopped me from believing those who called me worthless," she reminded him. "Prayer led me to trust you with the deed. Prayer raised that barn." She gestured toward the structure that now stood as a symbol of both hope and defiance. "Prayer will see us through this too." Sandro's breath came in ragged gasps as he fought against his anger. Slowly, reluctantly, he sank to his knees beside her. Together they bowed their heads as Samantha's voice rose soft but clear in the gathering dusk. "Lord, forgive those who acted in darkness. Give us strength to stand firm in your light. Show us the path through this valley, and grant us wisdom to follow where you lead." As they knelt there, the first stars appeared above them, tiny points of light piercing the darkness, like hope refusing to be extinguished. The moon cast long shadows through the cabin windows as Sandro paced the wooden floor, his footsteps heavy with anger. The empty pig pen stood as a dark reminder of the day's cruelty. He paused at the fireplace, where his father's old rifle hung above the mantel, its metal gleaming in the lamplight. "I won't stand idle while they threaten us," he said, reaching for the weapon. "A man must protect what's his." Samantha rose from her chair by the fire, her quilting falling forgotten to the floor. "Sandro, please." Her voice trembled, but held firm. "Violence will only prove them right about the land bringing trouble." "They killed Hope!" His fingers curled around the rifle's stock. Next time it might not be just the pig. "What then?" "Then we show them the true strength of our faith." Samantha crossed the room, placing her hand gently on his arm. "Your fists and bullets will only bring shame to everything we believe in." Sandro's grip on the rifle tightened. "What would you have me do? Watch while they destroy all we've built?" "No," Samantha said softly. "I would have you trust in a different kind of strength." She guided his hand away from the weapon. "Remember the barn raising? How many came to help? There are others who know us, who have seen God's work through these hands." The tension in Sandro's shoulders eased slightly. "The families you've helped?" "Yes." Samantha's eyes brightened. "Widow Kaufman's grandson, fever broken by grandmother's remedies, the Miller twins, their cough eased by my herbs, even Elder Yoda's wife, though he won't admit it, my tonics helped her through a difficult time." Sandro lowered his hand from the rifle. "You mean to gather witnesses?" "Truth speaks louder than threats," Samantha said. "If those we've helped stand with us, even the bishop must listen." Slowly Sandro nodded. The anger didn't leave his eyes entirely, but something else joined it. Hope, fragile as a spring shoot. They rose before dawn the next morning, hitching their most reliable horse to the wagon. The autumn air bit sharp and clean as they set out, frost crunching beneath the wheels. Their first stop was Widow Kaufman's small cabin on the settlement's edge. The widow met them at her gate, wrapped in a worn shawl. When Samantha explained their purpose, tears welled in the older woman's eyes. "Without your herbs, my Jacob would have joined his parents in heaven," she said, climbing into the wagon. "I'll tell any who'll listen how God worked through your hands." From there, they visited the Miller farm, where the twins' mother embraced Samantha fiercely. "My girls breathe easy now because of you," she declared, joining their growing group. At each stop, the wagon grew fuller. Sarah Byler, whose difficult birth Samantha had eased with careful tending. Young Peter Lapp, whose broken arm had healed straight thanks to her poultice. Even Rachel Yoder, the elder's wife, slipped out to join them while her husband was at market. "I haven't forgotten how you sat with me through the dark hours," Rachel whispered, squeezing Samantha's hand as she settled among the others. By evening, the wagon creaked under its precious cargo of witnesses. More followed on foot or in their own buggies, a quiet procession of those touched by Samantha's gift for healing. The sight brought tears to her eyes. "See," she said softly to Sandro, who drove with wonder on his face. "This is how we fight, not with fists or firearms, but with faithful hearts joined together." "I reckon you're right," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "This here's a stronger army than any I could have raised with anger." They paused at a crossroads, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant orange and purple. The assembled group, nearly 20 strong now, bowed their heads as Samantha led them in prayer. "Lord," she said, her clear voice carrying on the evening air, "you've gathered these dear souls to stand for truth. Guide us in your wisdom, strengthen us with your love, and help us show that your way leads through peace, not violence." "Amen," came the chorus of voices, strong and sure. Looking at the faces around her, faces lined with age and hardship, yet shining with purpose, Samantha felt a deep certainty settle in her heart. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not alone, but surrounded by the living testimony of God's grace, working through simple acts of healing and kindness. "Are you ready?" Sandro asked, taking her hand. Samantha squeezed his fingers, drawing strength from his touch and the presence of their friends. "Yes," she answered. "With truth and faith as our weapons, I'm ready for whatever comes." Dawn painted the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as the wagon train approached the bishop's hall. Morning dew sparkled on the grass, and wisps of fog clung to the ground like hesitant spirits. Samantha sat straight-backed beside Sandro, her plain dress freshly pressed, her prayer cap neat despite the early morning journey. Through the mist, she could make out several fancy carriages parked near the hall. The railroad men had already arrived. Her heart quickened, but she forced her breathing to remain steady, drawing strength from the presence of their supporters gathered behind them. "The Lord goes before us," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Sandro's hand found hers, work-roughened fingers offering silent support. "That he does." As they drew closer, Bishop Heinrich Lapp emerged from the hall, his stern figure backlit by the rising sun. 3 well-dressed railroad men flanked him, their polished boots and crisp suits standing in stark contrast to the simple clothing of the gathered Amish folk. The bishop's eyes narrowed at the sight of the wagon train. "What is the meaning of this gathering?" Samantha descended from the wagon, her feet finding solid ground despite her trembling knees. "These are my witnesses, Bishop Lapp. They've come to speak truth." "Truth!" One of the railroad men stepped forward, his watch chain glinting. "The only truth that matters is legal ownership of this land tract. You claim inheritance?" "I do." Samantha's voice carried clear across the morning air. "My grandfather left this land to me, with purpose and prayer behind his choice." The bishop's face hardened. "Your grandfather was not thinking clearly in his final days. This deed, you claim, threatens to bring worldliness into our settlement." "Nay, Bishop." Widow Kaufman stepped forward, her aged voice strong. "If you'll permit us to speak, we'll show you God's purpose in this inheritance." A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd of townspeople who had come to witness the confrontation. The bishop glanced at their faces, then gave a curt nod. "Speak then, but be brief." "We have business to settle." One by one, they came forward. Widow Kaufman told of her grandson, saved from fever. The Miller twins, now healthy and strong, stood beside their mother as she recounted their healing. Sarah Baylor spoke of her difficult birth, tears streaming as she held her healthy infant. Young Peter Lapp, the bishop's own nephew, showed how straight his once broken arm had healed. With each testimony, the murmurs grew stronger. Even some of the railroad men shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances as story after story revealed the depth of Samantha's service to the community. Rachel Yoder's testimony brought gasps, the elder's wife speaking publicly of how Samantha's care had helped her through dark times. "She never asked for payment." Rachel finished softly. "Only that we remember God's mercy." The bishop's stern expression wavered slightly, but he shook his head. "These good works do not change the fact that this land dispute brings unwanted attention to our settlement. The deed is legal." Sandro's quiet voice cut through the morning air. "And its purpose is God's work." One of the railroad men stepped forward impatiently. "Enough of this sentiment. Show us this supposed deed." Samantha reached into her apron pocket, where she had carefully stored the precious document. Her fingers trembled as she withdrew the paper, its edges worn, but the text still clear and official. The railroad man snatched it from her hands, scrutinizing it closely while his colleagues gathered round. "My grandfather," Samantha spoke into the tense silence, "saw that our community would need this land, not for railroad tracks or worldly gain, but for God's children who need shelter and healing." She gestured to the gathered witnesses. "These good people stand as testimony to that vision." The oldest railroad man looked up from the deed, his expression troubled. "This document appears legitimate. The signature and seal are proper." He turned to his colleagues. "We cannot legally contest this." Bishop Lapp's face reddened. "Surely there must be some way." "Nay, Bishop," Widow Kaufman interrupted gently. "Perhaps instead of fighting this blessing, we might see God's hand in it. Your own nephew stands here, healed by the wisdom God gave this woman." The gathered crowd pressed closer, their voices rising in support. "She helped my family too," came a call from the back. "And mine," added another voice. More joined in, a chorus of testimony rising with the morning sun. Samantha stood quietly at the center of it all, her hands clasped before her, waiting. The railroad men conferred in low voices, gesturing at the deed. The bishop looked out over his congregation, seeing faces he knew well, faces that now showed clear support for the woman he had doubted. The silence that followed felt heavy with possibility. Samantha thought of her grandfather, of his faith in her, of the pig that had started their journey, of Sandro's love that had grown from duty to devotion. She thought of the new barn, raised by willing hands, standing ready to shelter those in need. Most of all, she thought of God's perfect timing, bringing all these witnesses together on this misty morning to speak his truth. Thomas Whitley, the territorial clerk who had been standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, stepped forward. His spectacles caught the morning light as he adjusted them on his nose. "If I may examine the deed." The railroad man reluctantly handed over the document. Thomas held it carefully, his trained eyes moving methodically across the page. The crowd fell silent, watching as he traced his finger along the carefully written lines. Even the morning birds seemed to quiet their songs. His frown deepened as he turned the paper, studying its reverse side. Then his eyes widened. "There's something here." He pulled a small magnifying glass from his vest pocket and leaned closer. "What is it, Mr. Whitley?" one of the railroad men demanded. Thomas straightened, clearing his throat. "This document carries 2 separate seals of authority." He held up the deed so others could see. "Here, as expected, is the witness mark of the Amish elders who presided over the grant." His finger moved to another section. "But here, dated the same day, is the territorial court's official stamp and seal." A collective gasp rose from the gathered crowd. Bishop Lapp stepped forward, his face draining of color as he peered at the markings Thomas indicated. "That's impossible," one of the railroad men muttered, but Thomas shook his head. "No, sir, it's quite genuine. I've processed enough territorial documents to know our official seal." He adjusted his spectacles again. "This deed was registered with both church and state authorities. It's doubly binding, both by Amish law and territorial statute." The railroad men huddled together, speaking in harsh whispers. One cursed under his breath, earning disapproving looks from the Amish onlookers. Sandro's hand found Samantha's, gripping it tightly. She felt the tremor in his fingers matching her own, saw the tears welling in his eyes as the full impact of the revelation washed over them. The land was truly, indisputably hers, protected by both the authority of their faith and the power of territorial law. "Your grandfather was a wise man," Thomas said quietly to Samantha. he ensured no one could challenge your right to this land. He carefully folded the deed and handed it back to her. Not the railroad, not the church. No one can legally contest your ownership. Bishop Lapp stood silent, his usual stern demeanor crumbling as he realized the finality of the situation. The morning sun now stood fully above the horizon, its golden light touching everything with promise, as if heaven itself was confirming the justice of this moment. The railroad men lingered only long enough to mark new survey lines on their maps, their faces tight with barely contained frustration. The reroute would cost them, but the law left them no choice. They departed in their dust-covered wagon, leaving the settlement to its own affairs. Bishop Lapp stood apart from the dispersing crowd, his stern facade cracking under the weight of the morning's revelations. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his usually proud shoulders now bent with something that looked like shame. Several elders who had stood with him followed, their silence speaking volumes. As the sun began its slow descent toward evening, wagons started arriving at the Stoltzfus farm. First came the widows Samantha had helped, then families whose children she had healed. They brought food, golden-crusted pies, warm bread, and hearty stews in covered pots. The aroma of good cooking filled the autumn air. "We're grateful for what you done," Mary Byler said, pressing a fresh-baked cherry pie into Samantha's hands. Standing up like that, it took real courage. Children darted through the new barn's wide doors, their laughter echoing off the fresh-hewn beams. Their play brought life to the structure that had been raised in unity just days before. Young Peter Yoder led them in a game of hide-and-seek among the hay bales, his mother watching with tears of joy in her eyes. Tears of gratitude for the fever Samantha had cured last winter. As twilight approached, someone began to sing. The old hymn, "Great is Thy Faithfulness," rose into the evening air, voices joining one by one until the melody swelled with dozens of singers. Samantha, standing near the barn door, felt tears slip down her cheeks as neighbors who had once whispered cruel words about her size now sang beside her, their voices lifted in harmony. Sandro moved to stand beside his wife, his calloused hand finding hers. In the golden light of sunset, he raised his voice above the singing. "Thank you, Lord," he called out, his words clear and strong, "for giving us both a second chance, for showing us that love can grow even in barren soil, for teaching us that your justice prevails." "Amen," the gathered crowd responded. Samantha squeezed his hand, remembering the awkward wedding day that seemed so long ago now. The mockery of the pig dowry, the whispers, the doubt. All of it had led to this moment of vindication and celebration. More than that, it had led to love, real and deep, growing between her and Sandro like the herbs in her garden. The evening continued with shared food and fellowship, children playing and neighbors talking easily together. Where there had been division, now there was unity. Where there had been scorn, now there was respect. The new barn stood as a testament to what they could build together, and the land that had caused such strife would now serve as a refuge for those in need. The last wagon wheels creaked away into the darkness, leaving only cricket songs and starlight. Inside their cabin, Sandro added another log to the hearth, while Samantha settled into her favorite chair, the one he'd cushioned specially for her comfort. The firelight danced across their faces, casting warm shadows on the walls. Sandro turned to his wife, his eyes soft with emotion. "It wasn't the pig, Samantha," he said quietly, moving to sit beside her. "It was you who saved me." His voice carried the weight of truth, of a heart finally unburdened. Color rose in Samantha's cheeks, but her smile was steady and sure. She leaned into his embrace, feeling the strength of his arms around her. Through the cabin walls came the cheerful squealing of piglets, the ones born to their sow just last week, a reminder that life renewed itself in unexpected ways. Together they knelt by the hearth, their hands clasped in prayer. "Thank you, Lord," Samantha whispered, "for the gift of faith that carried us through." Sandro's deep voice joined hers. "For the love that grew between us, and for the family we are building together." The fire crackled softly as they prayed, its warm light promising comfort through the night until dawn. Their joined shadows on the wall stood as one, just as their hearts now beat as one. In this quiet moment, their new life stretched before them, bright with possibility and blessed with hard-won peace. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.